Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Andres,
And this is Lali.
and this is the Arts of Argument podcast. Now, today on the agenda, we are going to be talking about Rogerian and Aristotelian slash classical arguments. And later on, we will be talking about inductive and deductive arguments. So, to start us off, we all know Aristotelian arguments, you know?
Actually, I don't think I know much about that. No.
So Aristotelian arguments are kind of like the classical way of arguing, meaning like it's my way or the highway. My point I'm trying to argue to everybody who is in there,
Okay.
who I'm arguing with, all
Yeah.
parties involved.
Yeah.
And so for an example, right? Let's say we are in a disagreement on where we want to eat, right?
Okay.
Let's say I
Happens
want.
happens a lot. Yeah.
Let's say I want. What's a very common thing I want? Let's say Let's say Chipotle, right?
Okay.
And then what would you? What would you want?
I'll say I want Pan Express.
Pen Express, right? So here I would say Chipotle is a better option. You know, that's what I want,
Okay.
and I think we should just straight up go there, right? Not really like recognizing what you want and taking into account to what you want. So it's really the like what is called the classical way of arguing.
Yeah.
You know, it's more just you know what this is this. And so the reason why it would be important to learn Rogerian and Aristotelian arguments would be to be able to facilitate the discussions with the people in your life, because it's important to make sure that the discussions don't turn into arguments, which is the foundation of all arguments, is that they first are discussions when conflict arises. And I feel like that is where people's relationships are tested the most, is when there is conflict.
Definitely.
And so that is why you need to learn the arts of argument, which is ironically the
Name of the podcast.
Yeah. Funny enough, guess who you think coined the terms ethos, logos, and pathos?
Let me guess. Aristotle.
Exactly, and that's one of the foundations, the three foundations for Aristotelian arguments, which is basically, yeah, let's say, for example, me trying to appeal to you here.
Yeah.
And so it really, on paper, the Aristotelian argument really only works if one of us is open-minded to kind of caving in, and that's why it's
true.
problematic, because it's really only one person. It's like me pushing, wanting you to cave in. Once you cave in, then at that point, if that keeps going on, and it's more, if the stakes are higher, then that's where I feel like it is unhealthy.
Yeah.
Whereas in a Rogerian, it's more intellectual and trying to incorporate the morals of both sides and trying to come to a compromise, which I think is one of the most important factors in relationships with people. What do you?
Yeah.
Like
I totally agree with that. I feel like that's something I was thinking about too when you were explaining the Aristotelian argument, because when I asked my question, like, is that even an argument at that point? I guess that kind of answers it. I feel like no, because at some point one person is just gonna get tired of like the back and forth, and they're just gonna have to give in. And like you said, like, that's not healthy, and then it's just gonna become like a cycle of like we fight until whoever like wins, but it's not even like a fair win either. It's just kind of like maybe today I'll get lucky and the other person's tired and doesn't want to continue the arguing. They're like, you know what, fine, like, you know, and that keeps like bad like feelings within the relationship, kind of like tension, kind of some like I'm looking for a word, kind of like not remorse, but
What do you,
like bad feelings that you keep against people, like grudges,
grudges,
like
yeah.
that. Yeah, you'll hold like grudges against people.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
I feel like that's what that.
Yeah, and I feel like with like classical arguments, it's more like I feel like there's more deeper feelings involved. Like if you keep the reason why I feel like a lot of people, why Rogerian arguments are kind of more difficult, is because there's almost like an ego to it. Like they don't want to compromise. And I feel like that's very important to kind of like talk about arguments with people, like which is why I feel like it's kind of good that I'm doing this with you because I feel like it's good to be educated in general, especially on like a topic like this where it's like you kind of know the little parts and components of different types of arguments and what's a good argument, a healthy argument, unhealthy argument. And I feel like for like a classical argument, I feel like there's so much negative emotion at the moment between the tension between the two parties. It's just like it just grows, whereas like a Rogerian argument, like we said earlier, like it's more of a dance where you're just kind of revolving around like yin and yang, kind of just trying to incorporate a common ground and just having a nice discussion about my feelings and your feelings, what I think, what you think, and kind of just coming up with a compromise that works for both parties. And that's where I feel like for a lot of people it's a little bit difficult to do, like I say, because the ego just simply I feel
I've met plenty of people who when they argue they just won't be heard, or they won't like hear you.
They're close-minded.
Yeah, they're just extremely close-minded. They just believe what they believe, and it's super hard to argue with someone like that, and it just like makes you kind of dislike them, and it's like I'd rather not talk to you because I know if we get into an argument, like you're not going to change your mind.
That's fine. I mean, because it takes a certain level of emotional intelligence. And I feel that's important thing that people kind of
lack that nowadays.
I was going to say people don't really evaluate or aware of emotional intelligence period, let alone in themselves. Do you know what I mean? Because I feel
that's
like
true.
I mean, like the Rogerian argument, like that's more like Aristotle was a philosopher.
Yes.
And then Roger, what was his name again?
Carl Rogers.
Carl
I think that's what
Rogers.
his name
I
was.
forgot his name. But he's a psychologist,
Oh, that's interesting.
right? So I feel like that's kind of important to take into account
Yeah,
because
that is very
I
true.
feel like Aristotle,
Yeah, it's
like
just
the
like
fact that Aristotle, I feel like it's kind of like ironic and kind of cool, like symbolism between like Aristotle kind of being this older philosopher from long ago and kind of like it being like classical argument slash Aristotelian argument kind of being outdated, whereas the Rogerian argument being more modern and kind of the newer,
yeah.
like more healthy way to argue. And I feel like that's kind of important to take into account as well, kind of saying like, why are you going to go this old-fashioned, like older way? Because I feel like that's not really, I feel like that's crazy that we're using these old values
Yeah,
that are
a lot
very
of
outdated.
this is, yeah. I
Because
agree.
like there's a funny, like, not meme, but like this thing on like social media where it's like Aristotle wasn't smart. Like if I was born that long ago and no one knew anything, like I would be smart too. I would
No,
be
it's
considered smart too.
it's seriously
Yeah.
like they're just finding out things. They're like, what is justice? What is law? They're just like,
Yeah.
things that like if we lived in their times, we would have thought the same exact thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, like if you really think about it, philosophy or like ancient philosophy is kind of just very simple, honestly.
Right.
It's just a lot of asking questions, and that just like boggles your head around. And I feel like now, especially because Carl Rogers is like a psychologist, I feel like that makes it especially so that like he's really taking in consideration like people's feelings, people's like emotions, like how they react to things. So that's why he's able to come up with like a better like method of arguing, because it's like he knows that it like is more effective with people.
Right. To add on more on the topic of arguments, we're gonna talk about inductive and deductive arguments.
Okay, what are those?
So inductive arguments is general to specific, and deductive reasoning is specific to general.
Could you add on a little bit more about what that means?
So an example of inductive reasoning, is like for example, I like drinking coffee. So like every time I drink coffee after 5 p.m., I can't go to sleep.
Okay.
So drinking coffee late must cause me to stay awake. So okay.
I see.
And deductive reasoning. Sorry, did I say deductive?
You said inductive.
Okay, yeah, I meant inductive.
Yeah.
So deductive reasoning is, for example, when it's raining, the ground will be wet.
Okay.
It is raining, therefore the ground is wet. So the main difference here is deductive reasoning is more solid. It's more solidified. Your logic is sound.
Okay.
Remember, there's an actual argument there. Whereas inductive is more of a reach. Do you know what I mean? Like you're kind of is more not hypothesis. It's more of a guess.
Okay. Based on like something. Based on some data.
Based on some assumptions, on some reasons.
Some observations.
Yeah.
Maybe?
Right.
So basically, like deductive would be like definitive.
Yeah.
So it's like that's gonna be true because of the first claim.
Right.
Based on like actual logic. And then inductive would be like a guess, because you're just like, okay, if this is true, this could possibly be true based on what I've observed, like patterns, like observing patterns and stuff. Okay.
So a big reason why something like this is important is because I feel like a lot of people do inductive reasoning, like to make assumptions or just to kind of not to be to make themselves seem right in an argument. You know what I mean? Like again, like I say, the reason why it would be important to kind of get to know these components of arguments is because they show up a lot of the time when you're kind of discussing or arguing with someone. Or for example, if you look at like the political debates that are going on, like you can kind of like point out the deductive, inductive reasoning, where you can kind of see where like a lot of the time they do Aristotelian arguments rather than Rogerian arguments.
Yeah.
There's not really much of discussion. But to go back to deductive and inductive reasoning, I feel like that's common in where someone has a break in their logic or with their reasoning, they would kind of just try and make that reach. And I feel like a lot of the time you can kind of tell, oh, something's not right, or like, okay, yes, the one thing they say is true, the inductive reasoning where
Mhm.
one thing is true, but doesn't mean this other thing is
It's
also
automatically
true. Yeah.
true.
And yeah, so again, why inductive reasoning is important is, for an example, just setting routines. So yeah, let's say every time I skip breakfast, my energy is low.
Yeah.
Therefore, today I'll eat breakfast, so I have more energy.
So it's basically taking a pattern that you've observed and saying, okay, well, if that's true, then this is probably going to happen. So, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. And then whereas deductive reasoning, again on the routine part,
Mhm.
is let's say my class starts at 9.
Okay.
So I say it takes 30 minutes to get there. Therefore, I leave at 8:30. Where you see the flawed logic in there is, there's going to be difference in traffic, foot traffic. You don't take into account the time it gets into the classroom, find your seat, put it down. Also, when the teacher might start the class, or maybe disturbing your classmates in the classroom once the class has already started. And so, yeah, it's just an important tool to also use, and again, in everyday life and in your routine, that is no different. All right, to wrap everything up, to conclude everything, today in our podcast, we talked about Aristotelian slash classical arguments,
Yes.
Rogerian arguments, discussions, as we like to say, inductive reasoning versus inductive reasoning. And so, again, the reason why it's important to learn how to learn rhetoric is for a number of reasons. Yeah, every day we use rhetoric. We're affected by rhetoric. We're persuaded. We persuade people. Every time you go to a job interview or an interview in general, you try to sell yourself to the employer. Every day you're trying to convince your friends through your body language, through your actions, with your words, why you're of value with your friends.
Why you're valuable in like someone's life,
with emotions
basically.
and everything. You see how everything kind of connects together. And also just so you don't get manipulated by others.
That's interesting.
So you can strengthen your emotional intelligence and your intelligence in general. It's just important to know about arguments.
Yeah, no, definitely. I feel like this honestly has helped me understand a little bit more about. So I'm taking a class this quarter, and it's communications, and it's basically like principles of like oral communication. And one thing we're learning right now is rhetoric, and how to like persuade people with like our words, body language, stuff like that, and it's about rhetoric, rhetorical techniques. And I feel like this type of arguing definitely kind of like helps me understand a little bit more like what rhetoric is and like how to persuade people, how to like keep an argument, because obviously if I'm gonna give a speech about why you should think this, I'm gonna say, okay, well, you might think this, like I'm gonna appreciate and respect the audience so that they will value me more and like think I'm credible, like the ethos. And yeah, that just won't happen like an Aristotelian argument. If I'm just like, this is this, believe me, like that's it, I'm gonna lose my audience and they're not gonna listen to anything I have to say. So yeah, honestly, this is helpful.